beginning of the and then going through tomorrow to sort of the present day and what people are working on now. So to kick us off, why do we need these things called convolutional networks? And I know I haven't defined what that is yet. So the standard neural network architecture that we've looked at so far, where there's these strict sets of layers, and every neuron in a layer is connected to every neuron in the following layer, it does have some issues in certain situations. Some of the issues that we encounter when it comes to these fully connected networks is when we have a very high dimensionality of inputs. So when we're dealing with a lot of values coming into the network, in a traditional neural network, we need to have a neuron that receives. Sorry. Oh, all good. Um, we have to deal with all of these input values separately initially. So we have weights that connect the neurons individually to all of those values. This means that the number of parameters in our model scales with the size of the input data, which can be a really big problem when it comes to things like, very large or high resolution imagery. We also, as we've seen, we lose some of the spatial information in an image when we just flatten it and use it in a traditional neural network. So as we've seen when, we unravel the pictures of digits or things like that, it's not in the original structure that is actually what someone would see. And so we're losing a bit of the information about which of these pixels are actually next to each other, because the pixels that are directly above and below each other on two lines are now, unraveled and are far apart or things like that. So as we'll see tonight, convolutional neural networks try to address some of these challenges around, high dimensional input, as well as the issue of, preserving this spatial structure when we do our reasoning. As we'll find, these networks are really efficient for image recognition, as well as other tasks, because they both have a smaller number of parameters, so a smaller amount of weights and biases that we have to learn, and a significant amount of computational efficiency. So we get a lot of value from convolutional networks, even though they actually have fewer parameters than what the equivalent fully connected network would get us. I showed this slide in the very first lecture, and as we go through tonight and tomorrow night, we're going to look in more detail at each of these examples. We're going to talk about exactly what these are and what the computer vision tasks that are being shown here are going to be. But, just as a sort of look ahead, up here in the top left, this is Alex Krizhevsky AlexNet in 2012. That's the first thing that we're going to look at, where they showed that they could efficiently use convolutional networks to predict the subject of different images, all the way through to the modern real-time, we call this panoptic segmentation. So everything in the image is labeled, and not only is it labeled, but we sort of know exactly which pixels in the image belong to which thing. So you can see that, this is obviously a self-driving car example, and there's the road, there's the sidewalk, the pedestrians, obviously, but also signage and things like that. But as I, just briefly mentioned, there are also many other applications where convolutional networks are highly effective. So they're not limited to computer vision. So convolutional networks have found success in speech recognition and speech synthesis. They used to be used to a certain extent in natural language processing, although I would say that's less common now. There was a significant amount of success using convolutional networks to predict protein and DNA binding interactions. But really, the commonality here is that convolutional networks work really well in situations where there's some kind of spatial or sequential structure to the data. So across all of these things, that's, what convolutional networks are letting us sort of take advantage of. Okay, so again, I still haven't exactly talked about what a convolution is, so don't worry, that's in the next set of slides. But to sort of get us on our way there, I'm showing you this is the earliest convolutional network paper that really, made an impact in the field. Um, this one is published by a few famous researchers in deep learning, Bengio is very famous, and Yann LeCun is also one of these so-called godfathers of artificial intelligence. This is, as you can see, a network that was tasked with recognizing handwritten digits. So, in this case, also letters. So a similar task to the one that we worked on in the first assignment in some of the labs. And it showed that these convolutional networks could be used to sort of predict what digit or what letter was being shown with a reasonable degree of accuracy. What is sort of noteworthy about this, beyond the fact that it's one of the earliest examples, is that this is from 1998, and so the computational power that was available to train and then run a neural network in 1998 was extremely limited compared to today. And so, as we discuss this idea that convolutional networks are more efficient in the number of parameters that we need to use, this is really where that consideration starts, is that in 1998, without that ability to train the network with fewer parameters, it wouldn't have been possible at all. There wouldn't have been enough computational power to realistically train a fully connected neural network to do this task. But by contrast, by taking advantage of the fact that these convolutional networks are very efficient, they were, even with what was available at the time, able to train this model to have reasonable performance at the task. And so sort of a high level of what we see here, I hope that at the very least you can sort of see that we have multiple layers just like before. And these last three layers are fully connected neural network layers like we're used to. But as before we get there, we have some of these convolutional layers, and we also have these subsampling layers. So we'll get back to that concept in a little while, but the idea here is that, especially at this point, even the number of parameters that we were dealing with in these convolutions was maybe too high. And so they were reducing the sort of, you can think of it as the resolution of the image inside of the network in order to make that, computationally feasible for them to run. So really what we have here is one set of convolutions, a second set of convolutions here, a pair of these subsampling layers, which just are, reducing the dimensionality or the size of the image, and then a final set of three fully connected layers that take in the output of the convolutions and use that to make the prediction. Okay, so it's sort of that was a long preamble, and now we'll really get into it. So there's three sections that we'll talk through tonight. The first is, what exactly is this thing, the convolution that I'm talking about? What is it mathematically, and what does it look like to use this in a neural network? Then we'll talk a little bit about how CNNs are used for image classification. So taking a picture and predicting what the subject of that image is, that type of thing. And we'll also, as we go, look at a number of different convolutional neural network architectures, spanning the time that development has been happening. So that first one was 1998. Then there was about a decade or maybe even 15 years of AI winter where nobody really had a major advancement here. And then it picked back up in the 2010s, and there was a lot of effort that went on there. Okay, so first talking about convolutions. So as I said, we think about the value of the convolution first in terms of this sort of parameter efficiency, right? So let's say we have an image that is 640 by 480 pixels. That's actually kind of a low resolution image, right? It's not horrible, but your modern smartphone camera is going to take an image that is way higher resolution than that. So this isn't even an especially big image. We also have red, green, and blue color channels. So, for each pixel, we have three color values that we're storing. So we have 640 by 480 by 3, and that's the set of values that we have for this image. If we just do a standard neural network, one layer, we flatten and we have a dense connection to 1,000 neurons. We can calculate how many parameters there are to connect all of those input values to that dense layer of 1,000 neurons. And what we get is 922 million connections. So already, literally just for one layer, and for an image that's not even that high resolution, we are dealing with nearly 1 billion parameters that have to be learned in order to do this. And the insult to injury here is that we also don't even get the value of the spatial organization of that input because we're using this flatten operation. So, this again, casting your mind back to 1998, they just couldn't train a neural network that had 1 billion parameters. It wasn't, something that was feasible for them to do with the computers that existed at the time. Now it can be done, but even today, I would say that this is a fairly demanding computation, and back then it was just not possible. So, this is an example again of like something that we've seen already, 28 by 28 by 1. It's like MNIST, for example. This is how we would implement like a small neural network to predict those digits. And we can fairly straightforwardly, and we did this in the first assignment, we can insert some of these convolutional operations into that type of network. So just as in the fully connected network, we're taking in our 28 by 28 by 1 pixel image. But now, instead of immediately flattening it, what we're going to do is we're going to pass through a couple of pairs of convolutions and these dimensionality reduction or pooling layers, which I'll talk about in a minute. Once we have done all of our convolutions, we do then flatten the data again. And this is because we're going to go to a standard dense layer, which we then ultimately use for prediction. So as it says down here, the 2D spatial organization of our features is preserved as long as we don't flatten. So at some point we need to do that because we're making a prediction in 1 dimension and not 2. So at some point we're going to have to switch from 2 dimensions to 1. But we can take advantage of doing the reasoning in the original sort of dimensionality for a lot longer by using these convolutional networks. And yeah, so I mean, it's fairly straightforward to add these in. Again, we did a version of this in the first assignment, so hopefully that's at least a little familiar. But now let's take a look at what it actually means to do one of these convolutions. Okay, so this animation is showing what actually happens when we apply a convolution to an input. So if we imagine that this 5 by 5 grid here is our input image, and it's a very basic one. These are only ones or zeros. There's no other possible values. And we want to apply a convolutional layer to that image. So the convolutional layer is this 3 by 3, in this case, grid that we slide over the image. And at each step, we're going to multiply the pixels by the multiplicative values that are shown in the bottom right corners there. These are our weights that we're learning. So this is the analogy back to the standard neural network layer, is that we're going to be learning, just like in a fully connected layer, we learn a weight that we multiply the input by. In the convolutional layer, we're learning these values that go in each of these boxes that we're going to multiply the corresponding input value by. The difference between this and the fully connected layer is that rather than learning one parameter for each of the connections in from the input data, we're learning this 3 by 3 grid, and then we essentially reuse it over the whole image. So we are using the same set of parameters at every part of the image progressively over it. And so the output here is the dot product of the grid of weight values with whatever is currently placed on top of in the input image. So just like the standard neural network layer where we do the dot product of the weights with the input to get the value for the neuron, the pre-activation value. This is sort of the equivalent of the pre-activation values, except now they have a dimensionality, a second dimension to them. And the size of this output is determined by how many of these sliding operations we have to do in order to move across the entire image. So as you watch on the left here, you can see that we have to slide over 2 times. So we have 3 left to right windows. And then we also have to slide down 2 times. So we have 3 up and down. And so correspondingly, what we get is a 3 by 3 grid of outputs. And if you watch, you'll sort of see that happen, right? So, there is this analogy to the standard neural network layer that we still have a set of weights, and we're still doing the dot product of those weights with the input. But now we are learning this set of weights that we are reusing across the entire input. And one of the analogies that I like to use here to sort of explain why this makes sense or why it's useful to do this is you can think of each of these sets of weights, these 3 by 3 grids, or they can be other sizes as well. You can think of them as a pattern that we're looking for somewhere in the data. We don't know where it might show up, but we know that it might show up at some point. And as we slide that grid over the data, we're essentially saying, is it here? Is it here? Is it here? And so on and so forth. And then the output values, just like a neuron in a neural network gets excited if it receives the input it expects, the values in this grid are high if the pattern is in that part of the image, and they're low if the pattern is not in that part of the image. And so essentially what this output tells us is where in the original input we think it's likely that this specific pattern might be showing up, whatever that pattern is going to be. When we go to the lab in the second part of the session today, we'll see some examples of, specific patterns that we can build a convolution to look for in an image. So things like edge detection is something that we can do here. But for now, I hope that makes a certain amount of sense. And then, the mathematical operation here is really, the same as it is in a fully connected layer, except for the fact that we're having to do this sliding operation over the whole image. But mathematically, as linear algebra, it sort of works the same way. So, there's a lot of benefits that come from this type of architecture for neural networks. Um, there's this concept that we talk about as local connectivity, which means that each output value in our resultant grid here is only dependent on the data in a small region of the image, which allows us to sort of separate out what might be going on in different parts of the image in the processing. And then there's also this really, really crucial concept called translation invariance. And this is an intimidating term for something really simple. It really just means that we can identify a pattern no matter where in the image it shows up using one of these features. So because we're checking this grid against all of the different parts of the image, as long as we're confident that this grid helps us to identify some pattern, then no matter where it shows up, we can find it. And so this is really useful because, if I take a picture of a dog and I say to the network, is this a dog? That doesn't change based on whether the dog's face is in the top right of the image or the bottom left of the image or something else. So it's really, really important that we be able to identify the same features, the same patterns in the input, regardless of where they physically are in that input. And this is something that convolutional networks allow us to do. By contrast, in a standard neural network, you would essentially need to relearn that identification for each individual part of the image because you have different neurons and different parameters for each of those, input values. And so, yeah, the comparison to these fully connected networks, we use this concept of parameter sharing. I don't really like the term parameter sharing, but this is what I was saying when I said that we're reusing the same parameters across the whole image, because we just have one set of weights that we're reusing. I think sharing is a little confusing as a term. Um, and because we're now making use of the spatial structure of the data, it's inherently a better fit for vision, right? We're not throwing away something that could be useful by flattening the data before we make prediction on it. And then somewhat interestingly, there's actually research, fairly old research, that shows that this concept of the convolution is similar to how animal vision processes patterns and imagery. That there is a similar concept where there are these receptive fields that can activate if a pattern shows up in any part of the visual space, regardless of where that is. So there's a strong connection to biology there as well. There's a couple more pieces to the puzzle here. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, we don't just have a height and a width to our image, but we also have a number of channels. And in the input, the number of channels is typically red, green, and blue, or another way of representing color. It doesn't have to be, right? If I was using some kind of heat vision camera, then one of the channels could be the temperature of each part of the image. It's not required to be color, but there is this sense that for each pixel, we have multiple different values that correspond to that single pixel. In general, we typically do separate convolutions for each of those channels and then add it all together so that there's like a total activation for all of those channels. You can do things that are more sophisticated as well that combine those values in a more intelligent way, but for the most part, there's actually a surprising amount of efficacy from just doing that, computing each channel and adding it up. And then the other thing to note is that for each layer of the network, we do many different convolutions. So, we sort of represent these as being stacked convolutional filters. And the analogy or the idea here is that each of these filters is looking for a different pattern in the image. So we learn as many filters as we think there might be different patterns that we need to identify. And then there's going to be a corresponding output, which is whether or not that pattern showed up in each part of the image. So a high value if that pattern was recognized, and a low value if that pattern was not recognized, or something to that effect. And so now, the output number of channels is no longer how many colors we have, but instead it is how many filters or how many kernels, as they're called, we trained in the intermediary layer. So here we're starting with an image, presumably a color image that's 28 by 28. We've got our RGB values. Here, what we have is we have 4 filters that are 5 by 5 by 3. So they're 5 by 5, and then they're dealing with the 3 color channels. So the total here is 5 by 5 by 3 by 4. And then the output, because we're smushing together the red, green, and blue into a single value in the output, is going to be 24 by 4 by 4. And so, you could keep those red, green, and blue separate, but then you would have a 4-dimensional output here. And then you're gaining parameters again, so things can get a little bit complicated. So, the size of these kernels, there's a number of different words that are used to refer to these things. They're sometimes called a kernel, they're sometimes called a filter, and the biological analogy is a receptive field. I'll try to be consistent and call it a kernel. But so the size of these kernels is typically an odd number. I think these are all prime numbers, actually. In general, these are usually fairly low values. So the patterns are usually not super complex in their structure, but it can be different for different tasks that you're dealing with. So it's something that you need to test, as many things are. And then, yeah, the output dimension is computed by, how many of these, the output dimension is how many sliding operations we have to do over the image. There's a computation to figure out what it is here, but you just imagine like how many times do I have to slide this across in order to go from one end of the image to the other. There's a couple of hyperparameters that we have to factor in. The first is called strides. And so, the strides are how many pixels we move over when we go to the next step of the operation. So the standard would be to do a stride of 1, where we move over 1 pixel at a time. But we can also move over 2 at a time or 3 at a time. so on and so forth. Um, the key reason to do this would just be to reduce the number of output values that we have to deal with. So this isn't something that gets us more information. In fact, it gets us less information, right? Because we're sort of moving over the intermediate sets of possible operations. But there are many cases where our highest priority is actually to reduce the dimensionality of the data we're working with. So, I was showing how many parameters we would need for this 640 by 480 image, but imagine if you have like a 4K or an 8K image that you're dealing with. One of the things that you're going to be doing in those first few layers is just working to reduce the dimensionality until it becomes manageable. And so this is one way to do that. On the other hand, sometimes we're particularly concerned about patterns that might appear on the edge of an image. So, for example, if you can imagine, I was saying recognizing a dog, what happens if the dog is sort of like right on the edge of the image and you can only see half of its face? We might want to actually apply the convolution as if it's going over the edge of the image and see if we have like half of a pattern that we're looking for. And so padding allows us to do that. It essentially imagines that the image is larger than it actually is. And we usually just fill all those remaining values with zeros. So what that lets us do is look for patterns that might be occurring on the very edge of the image. The other benefit of that is if we actually want to keep the number of output values higher. So although in most cases what we're trying to do is keep them lower, introducing padding actually, it means that we have to do more of these sliding operations, right? So if we care about keeping the values, the number of values higher, then we can also do padding in order to accomplish that. Okay, and then you saw it in some of the figures earlier, but I didn't talk about it just yet. The thing that comes along with convolutions is this pooling operation. And this really is just an operation that allows us to do spatial dimension reduction. So you can think of this as like just a lowering of the resolution of an image. This is non-parametric. It doesn't have any weights that have to be learned. It's just a operation that we know exactly what it's going to be every time. And so two of the most common versions of this pooling are max and average pooling. So here we are seeing an example of max pooling, and all it does is it divides up the image and it takes the highest value in each of these sections and it keeps that. And so again, thinking about how thinking about what these values mean, if we've just come off of a convolution, this is telling us in each of these squares whether the pattern that we're looking for, seems to appear in that part of the input, right? So as we slide that window across, we're checking for this pattern and we get a high value if the pattern appears. And so what we're doing with max pooling is we're, still just checking if the pattern appears in this larger area. And accordingly, because we care if it is there, we can just take the highest value and say, that's our indication of in this larger region, does the pattern appear in any part of this region? So we lose some information about where exactly it is, but we still know that it's in this area at all. And so, that's max pooling. Hopefully, somewhat obviously, average pooling, you just take the average of these values. The point is, this doesn't add any parameters. We don't have to learn any extra weights in order to do this, but it does lower the amount of values that we have to keep track of. So this is a useful operation when we're trying to bring down the complexity of the network. And this is just a little animation that is sort of showing that happening. And you can also see there's no overlap here. We only treat each pixel one time in this operation. Okay, so pooling, spatial dimension reduction. Again, it has this property of local invariance. It's not affected by things that happen in other parts of the image. And there's no parameters either. So, the operation is the same throughout training. Okay, so next let's look at some examples of different convolutional network architectures. So as I have sort of introduced, the classic architecture for a convolutional network is that we have the input, and then we have sets of these convolutional blocks where we do some number of convolutions and we finish with a max pooling or an average pooling layer. We may repeat that process. So, we may do like times, sorry, let me try that again. Times two or something like that, where we do this whole thing, and then we have another set of these blocks to do it again. And then when we ultimately want to make our prediction, we need to flatten and then go down to fully connected layers. And if it's classification, then we're going to need to do softmax as well. So that's sort of the basic version of this convolutional architecture. But there are many, many other architectures that expand on this concept further. So as I was alluding to, 1998, there was LeNet from Yann LeCun that showed that convolutional networks could be used to predict these image classes for digits. And then there was really about 15 years where there were no significant contributions in this field of convolutional neural networks. And a big part of that was that, even with the parameter reduction that we got from this method, the computational power was just like not there to train these networks. It wasn't really available. That is until 2012, where this paper comes from Alex Krizhevsky. I forget who the second Alex is there, Ilya Sutskever, and Geoffrey Hinton. And so in this paper, they showed a new convolutional network that was trained for a much harder task of classifying between 1,000 possible classes that the image could belong to. The big contribution of this paper is not obvious from this slide, but this is actually one of the first papers that showed that GPUs could be used to train neural networks effectively. And so really what kicked off the sort of the deep learning revolution of the 2010s was this paper and a few other papers of the time that showed how we could use GPUs to very, very effectively train neural networks at speed. And so that was the key contribution here. Now, you'll notice that this network does something weird, which is that it seems to be running two networks almost in parallel that split off here. So we can see that we actually have two sets of kernels that are independently calculated from one another. There's many kernels within these. There's a second operation here and a second operation here that are completely in parallel. We then sort of move across where we recombine these like this before continuing in parallel for a while, and then ultimately doing like fully connected networks where everything is brought back together at the end. So this is a really weird looking architecture. It's very different from what we've seen so far. The reason this was done was so that they could train this network on two GPUs at once. So this is largely done for computational reasons, as opposed to reasons of benefiting the architecture itself. So with the exception of, this point here where we cross these patterns over and then, the ending here, all of these parts are happening in parallel, and are largely not dependent on each other, which means that we can have two completely separate GPUs doing the calculations. So we can do the forward propagation separately, and also for the most part, we can do the backwards propagation separately, where we update the weights in these parameters. And so this was, the early example of parallelism in neural networks, which I think somebody asked me about in a previous lecture, how we could take advantage of parallelism. And this was an attempt to do that so that we could, efficiently train the network. Now, this is largely not done anymore. This paper presents this architecture, but for the most part, we do just have a single thread from beginning to end with a few exceptions. However, the value here was showing the ways that we could break out of the standard neural network architecture and sort of try to be a little bit clever with how they're designed, both in terms of improving predictions, but also in terms of taking advantage of the hardware that we have available and what it works well at doing. And so, we have some examples of the kernel shapes here. The number of parameters in this convolutional layer is very small, 35,000 or so. That's really not a lot of parameters. And just for the sake of argument, the equivalent number of parameters in a fully connected network, 43 million, I guess that is. It's way too many to be able to deal with in practice. Or is that, yeah. Here is sort of the breakdown of more of what is going on inside these different convolutions. I'll leave this for a review if you want to come back to these slides. But the point is that there's different sizes of filters here. Interestingly, this first filter is actually quite large, 11 by 11, before we go down to mostly 3 by 3 filters for the rest of the network. And there's different amounts of strides. There's different amounts of padding as well that go through here. Also worth sort of noting is that, I think I've mentioned this before, but in general, we start with a smaller number of kernels earlier in the network, and then we go to a larger number as we progress. And this is because the early kernels are identifying simple patterns in the data, like an edge or, a bit of shadow, things that are likely to repeat quite a lot. But as we go through the network and as we get close to the end where we're trying to make our prediction, these filters are going to represent things that are more and more specific. And so we're going to need more of them in order to represent all of those different possible things. So it's not strictly getting larger, but you can see that compared to the first convolution, we do have more filters later on in the image. I love this slide. This is sort of showing what I've been talking about when I say that the early patterns are simple and the later patterns are complex. And so this is pulled out of a real convolutional network trained on this ImageNet data set. And it's showing essentially there's a little bit of complexity to it, but essentially this is showing what picture would make this single convolutional filter the most excited if it saw. So what pattern, is going to make that value as high as possible? And they can do that by sort of working backwards and saying, if we imagine that we got a really high value out, what would it take to get that? So, this shows how these patterns build up and get more complicated as we go through the network. And so early on, just like I said, most of these patterns, the thing that they're looking for is, some variation on a straight line or a gradient of some kind. So, here, this is a straight line, this is a straight line. These are all just basically lines at different angles. One downside of convolutional networks, so I said that they're translation invariant, right? The pattern can show up in any part of the image. They're not rotation invariant. So they don't, the sort of orientation does matter to a convolutional network, which is actually a little bit of a downside, right? Because a flipped upside down picture of a dog is still a dog, but convolutional networks struggle with that. And so that's why you see that a lot of these patterns are actually very similar, but they're essentially just lines at slightly different angles. Because although it can recognize these, lines in any part of the image, as far as it's concerned, these are completely different features. So there isn't this sense of translation or of rotation invariance. It cares about the angle. But the thing I want you to take away here is just that these are very, very simple patterns that it's looking for. As we move from the low-level features to the medium-level features, we start to see these are a bit more complex, right? They're hard to identify as really anything in particular. This is some kind of like maybe it's a wheel, maybe it's an eyeball. There's clearly something there. This is like some kind of checkerboard over here. Um, again, there would be many, many hundreds of these kernels. So this is just a small, sampling of them. But the point is that we're beginning to see slightly more complex things that are being looked for in the image. And then at the high level, so this is just before the prediction is actually going to happen, we're now seeing pretty complex patterns that, if you look closely, sort of do track as being like real things that we can identify. So if you look at this one here, I think this is pretty recognizably some kind of bird. Um, I hope that you can see that as well. And so that means that we have a whole convolutional filter that is looking for a bird in the image. And what's likely then is that, when at the output, if this value is high, then we're really, really sure that there's some kind of bird in the picture. Directly to the left of it is like very recognizably some kind of honeycomb pattern, and to the right, I don't know, maybe this is like a picture of a neuron or something. I'll just pick out a couple others. This looks like it might be a hot air balloon or a water tower, and this looks like it's probably a wheel, very similar to what we actually see in this sample image up here. Um, the point is that I hope this is fairly clear that we can see how the complexity of these patterns builds up, and they go from being very simple to very specific and complex, so that then when we feed these patterns into the classifier, it's actually really easy to tell what it's seeing from these patterns. Because if these are the things that I'm seeing, if we imagine that these five are excited and nothing else is, then I know that I've got like a wheel, a water tower, a honeycomb, a bird, and a neuron. And the network can just say that that's the answer, because those are the things that are being excited. Okay, so uh, 2012, AlexNet shows that we should start paying attention to convolutional networks again. It shows that we can use GPUs in order to train these networks at scale. And at the same time, GPUs are becoming a lot more powerful. So now researchers are interested in, how deep can we make these networks? How many layers can we stack on top of each other, and improve the performance? Because again, the more of these layers we have, the more complex and specific the patterns that the network can learn to recognize are. So 2 years later, VGG16, it's kind of obvious what they've done here, which is they've just stacked a bunch of these filters, on top of each other. And again, what the approach here is to start with very large filters at the start, going down to very small filters as we go further and further on. And we're also increasing the number, and this time we're strictly increasing it. So it goes from 64 filters at the start up to 512 filters at the end. And then again, we just do some fully connected layers before we have a prediction of our 1,000 possible classes in ImageNet at the end here. And this is how you would implement VGG in Keras. So we're getting a little bit complicated here. Still not too bad, because essentially we're just adding more convolutional layers. But the complexity is certainly increasing, and the number of parameters is increasing, right? So here we see that the total number of parameters in this model is 138 million. So now this is really only possible because of the new understanding of how we can use GPUs to train these networks. So this is not an insignificant amount of computation. It simply wouldn't have been possible in 1998, but here in 2014 it can be done. So it's a very exciting time for neural network and computer vision training. And we see that these layers in particular, I think especially down here, this is a huge culprit for the size of our network. So if you compare the number of parameters at the start to the number of parameters at the end, it gets a lot higher as we go through the network here. Okay, so at this point in 2014, people are interested in how deep can we make these networks? How many layers can we keep stacking on top of each other in order to do it? And so, the next big publication is ResNet, 2016 now. And so this is VGG that I just talked about on the previous slide. And then this is ResNet. And so you can see that, the number of convolutional layers is just getting larger and larger and larger as we go. But with ResNet, at this point, there started to be a problem where the number of layers started to actually cause an issue when it came to training the network. So during backpropagation, during training, we compute the partial derivatives of the error in the system with respect to each individual parameter, right? And the way that we compute those is by multiplying the partial derivatives of every layer that is between us and the end of the network. As we move backwards, we have to do more of these multiplications because we're sort of propagating that error back through all the partial derivatives to whichever parameter we're currently computing. So my relationship where I'm standing to the output error is influenced by all of the parameters that stand between me and that error. Does that make sense? Whatever influence I have is affected by whoever I'm influencing in order to get to that final prediction. I don't care about what I received in terms of computing these errors, but I do care about, I made this output and then that caused that neuron to make that output and so on and so forth all the way until the end. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that concept is at least somewhat clear. No, no, I'm seeing no's. Okay. So tiny quick review of backpropagation. As when we're training the neural network, we take, let's say, a single input sample. We go through our network with that input sample and we make a prediction. We then compute the error between that prediction and the real answer, and that is our loss value. Then what we need to do is we need to compute the error, the error with respect to each parameter in the system. So thinking back to our dials that we're adjusting, this is saying if I increase the dial or if I decrease the dial, what is that going to do to my error? And we can compute these gradients so that we understand, we can mathematically know whether for that example, we should have increased a specific parameter or decreased that parameter in order to reduce the total error in the system, right? That all sound familiar? Okay, so with our multiple layers, we have to compute these partial derivatives, right? So this is something I talked about briefly in the second lecture. The way that we compute how much we need to change each of these parameters is dependent on the parameters that are closer to the end of the network than whatever we're currently dealing with. And so one way to think about it is that, so let's say that I'm updating, here I'm going to go back to a simpler slide. Okay, maybe not. Let's say I'm updating the parameters, we'll use VGG. Let's say I'm updating the parameters here, right? The amount that I update these parameters is going to be dependent on how much I already wanted to update the parameters in everything that is closer to the end of the network. Because we start at the back and then we work our way towards the beginning. And so as we go, we're making these updates, and the updates that we're going to do are conditioned on what we've already computed. And this is sort of the idea behind backpropagation, is we work our way through the network, making these updates, which allows us to then understand the previous layer and then the previous layer, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how we've trained all of these neural networks. The issue that starts to show up as we come to this many layers is that as we're doing these errors, we're computing these partial derivatives, right? And the partial derivatives are multiplied together. That's the operation that we do. The numbers in these partial derivatives are small, right? They're like 0.7 or negative 0.01. It's analogous to how much we're increasing or decreasing these weights. You can just take my word for it. Um, when we start multiplying those values together, when I start multiplying 0.7 by 0.1 by 0.2, what we get are numbers that start to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what happens is that the sort of volume of the information, the values that are going back through this network, the numbers get smaller and sort of the volume is getting smaller too. So at the start, if we imagine that, this set of lines is like how much we are going to change the parameters in the network, as we go back, we're updating the parameters less and less because we're multiplying these values that are below 1 together. And then as we get to the start, we begin to like barely change the parameters at all because these values keep getting smaller and smaller. And so this is called the vanishing gradient problem, which is that multiplying together more and more of these numbers that are less than 1 causes the final product to get smaller and smaller. And so the amount that we're adjusting the dials at the very beginning of the network becomes incredibly tiny. And so with VGG 16, VGG 19, it's just the number of layers. They sort of thought this is about as deep as we can go before we hit this vanishing gradient problem until ResNet came along. And so what ResNet does is it introduces these things that they call skip connections. And so what's happening here is that the output of this layer goes through this part here, but it also skips over here and gets added to the output of this layer. And so it's like we're skipping a layer at the same time. And mathematically, what this does in our backpropagation step is it means that the error in this layer is now more highly influenced by what's going on later in the network when the values are bigger still. And so by adding these skip connections, essentially what happens is we are keeping the values of the gradients higher than they would otherwise be if they weren't there. So a way to think about it is like when we do backpropagation, we're sending information up the network about how we want to change it. And adding these skip connections is almost like creating an information highway that these gradients can pass through, where they can basically send this information as far back as they want using these skips without having to go the slow route all the way through the network. And I know that's very analogizing, but the end result here is that it enables us to train networks that are very, very deep in a way that was not possible without these skip connections. And they show that in practice in this paper. So here's sort of zooming in a little bit at what exactly one of these skip connections looks like. They call this a residual learning block. So we have two weight layers, and the input to this pair of weight layers is actually combined with the output. So we add it back in to the output of this set of layers so that we have both the prediction and the original thing recombined as the output here. And this is all of the stuff that I just talked about is very briefly summarized as good optimization properties. So that's what that means, is this whole complicated thing about these skip connections. The reason I wanted to talk about that and make it clear is, partly to sort of emphasize the different ways that these networks get built, but also because this thing here is almost like a precursor to what happens in the modern large language model architectures. So this is like an early example of this more complex building block that is then going to sort of come back conceptually in large language models. So it's a really important concept and is something that it's really worth taking a couple minutes to understand in detail. Okay, but so the end result of this is that these ResNet models, 2016, were significantly higher performance than the VGG models from a couple of years earlier. But amazingly, they actually have fewer parameters. So there's a greater number of layers, but the layers are actually smaller than they were in VGG 16 or VGG 19. Um, so the depth, which again, the depth is like the complexity of the patterns, and the width is like how many patterns we consider. So they're actually able to get away with fewer total patterns by increasing the depth and what that complexity is. And it's also, unlike VGG, where we have three fully connected layers at the back here, the ResNet approach only has a single fully connected layer right at the very end. So it's keeping the image structure for as long as it possibly can. Um, I hate this graph because it's actually going it's going backwards in time. So the right hand here is the end is 2010, and then going towards the left is going forward in time to 2015, which I don't know why it's done that way. But what we're seeing here is the number of layers is increasing dramatically. So 2010, 2011, this was sort of pre-deep learning. Um, it's just for comparison. We see AlexNet in 2012. It jumps up to 8 layers. And then we sort of see this explosion in deep learning where we go to VGG. GoogleNet was sort of an intermediary step. And then ResNet is all the way up here at 152 layers. And then we also see that the error in ImageNet is, really clearly decreasing over that time. So this is the top 5 classification error. So this is a really generous error. It's saying, is the correct answer in any of the 5 top guesses that the model made? You don't even have to get the right answer. You just have to, think it's one of the likely candidates. And so even with that top 5 error, in 2010, they were getting like 28% error. So 28% of the time, it wasn't even guessing the correct answer in the top 5. And then in the course of just 5 years, that drops all the way to 3.5%. So now, better than 96% of the time, it's able to do this. And that really, happened in a short amount of time. And this, here really is the sort of story of the deep learning boom of the 2010s that we see. And so today, these architectures get even more complex and sort of interesting in their design. So, these are some examples of modular building blocks that can be inserted into networks where, now we have many different layers that are sort of being applied in parallel as well as in sequence. There's like a little tiny link back to AlexNet with its 2 parallel sets of operations, but now we have even more different things that can be happening and combinations and recombinations. It's definitely an active area of research. And the networks keep getting more sophisticated. If you've never been to this website, it's a really great website. It's called Papers with Code, and researchers can submit their new work to it, and you can go on there and you can see what the state of the art is for different tasks. So ImageNet, this image classification on ImageNet was the task for computer vision that all these papers were trying to improve on. And you can go to this site and you can see what the best performance is today and what networks are able to accomplish that. As we'll talk about at the end of the class, not tonight, but the end of the program, transformer-based architectures that are the technology that's used in like ChatGPT, those now broadly beat out all of these existing networks by quite a bit. But there are other really interesting approaches that are worth knowing about too or learning about too. So EfficientNet is one that I'm a big fan of because, as the name implies, it manages to get very strong performance. So performance here is getting higher while being actually quite a lot smaller in terms of computation than all of these other networks. So that's quite a nice result that they get here. And you'll notice that now we're talking about not top 5 accuracy, but top 1 accuracy. So these models are so good now that we no longer have to, be very generous and say you only need to get the answer in the top 5. Now you really need to get the right answer as your single guess. Many, many other examples of state-of-the-art algorithms that I'll leave for review as well. Okay, it's 7 p.m. I definitely need a drink of water, so let's take our 15-minute break, and I'll come back and talk about pre-trained models, and then we'll go on to the lab. I want to apologize. I missed that there were a few questions happening in the chat while I was talking earlier. I think that some of those have been addressed by other participants, but before I move on, is there anything that someone wants to make sure that I definitely answer? Are there any lingering questions that you would like me to cover before I go on to the next section? Yep, go ahead, Antonio.
Hello. Yeah, it's something that it's not super duper important, but I'm just curious. In the slide 29, the one that's VGG 16.
Sorry, I'm just.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, go
ahead. Yeah, this one?
Yes.
This slide?
Correct.
Yeah.
So the first thing that they do is that they pass a kernel, like several kernels, that is just exactly the same size as the image. So when you do something like that, what is your purpose? I mean, basically, when I see that, it's like, okay, let's check that it's not grandma picture, it's not my cousin Sylvia picture. Like, what are they checking there?
Yeah, this is a good question. So it is a little surprising with everything that I mentioned, because we sort of talk about the whole point of these being that we can slide them around. And these 224 layers we clearly can't slide around. My sort of intuition for why this might be happening is that you can sort of think of this as analogous to a fully connected layer, but in the structure of a convolutional network. So we have unlike the remaining convolutional layers, we have like a one-to-one relationship here from the input pixels to each of the outputs in these huge kernels. And so what this allows us to do is any sort of early and very like image-wide operations that we might want to be able to do. So if there's information that is like, so there's this concept of the kernels only care about what is happening locally in a certain part of the image, right? But there may be times where actually there are things going on in very, very disparate parts of the image, like the top left and bottom right corner, that we actually do care about making some kind of link between them. Having these layers at the start is going to allow us to do that if it's necessary. So at the very start, if there is some link between, what's going on up here and what's going on down here, we can do something with that in these first few layers before we then go on to our sort of more standard layers.
So they are very sparse kernels with lots of zeros and looking at two different details.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, now I get it.
So
Okay.
this lets us sort of bring together parts of the image if we need to that might be relevant to each other before we go on to our more standard convolutions that we've described.
Okay, and this has nothing to do with the fact that the input is coming RGB 3 layers, right?
No, that's unrelated. Yeah, that's something that we don't really use. We don't really pay that much attention to that in these contexts.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Really good question. Okay, great. Does anybody else have any questions that they want to make sure that I get to before we move on? There's always a chance later, but I just wanted to check because again, I didn't really see the chat earlier. Okay, I'm going to move on then. Okay, let me get back to where I was. 1 second. Okay, pre-trained models. Right, so so far we've looked at models that we initialize with random weight values, and then we train end to end on a task that we're dealing with, right? This is the standard machine learning approach. We build a model, we train it on the data. Great. When we start looking at these very large models, and again, this now is smaller than the cutting edge models that we see, but this is still a large model. And you know, if if we cast our minds back to 2016, using one of these ResNet models might be feasible, but training one might not be feasible for us. It's going to be very computationally intensive to train one of these networks. And it might not be something that is really realistic for us to do on the computing power that we have available. So around this time, what we start to see is this idea of taking a model that somebody else has already trained, and using that as our starting point, even if we're going to continue to train the network further. So, here, the training a model on ImageNet could take days or weeks, depending on the model. But there are already many models out there that have already been trained, that someone's already done that work, and the weights, the parameters of that network are publicly available. So what we can do is we can take that existing network, and we can just change it a little tiny bit in order to learn about a new problem that is similar but not exactly the same. And this concept is called transfer learning. So the idea here is that we're transferring what the model has already learned about a different task into the task that we care about solving. So we're using pre-trained weights, and what we do is we remove the final few layers, and we replace them with new layers that are adjusted for our new task. Um, so, visually, if we go back to, one of these networks, at the very bottom here is where we have these fully connected layers that take the outputs of our image processing and actually make a specific prediction. And so in the case of transfer learning, it's these layers at the very end that we would replace. So all of the image processing would stay the same as it's already been trained, but at the end, we would put in new layers that would actually take those features and make a different prediction. So, going back to that picture that I love of this hierarchical representation, the idea behind transfer learning is that no matter what kind of image you're working with, these low-level features are probably going to be useful for you. It's a waste of time to learn these from scratch every single time we build a network, because these are patterns that come up again and again in many different kinds of images. And if the images that you're dealing with are similar enough to the model that was already trained, then maybe you also want to keep these mid-level features. And if it's really similar, you might even want to keep these high-level features as well. So the idea here is that we can take advantage of the fact that all of this stuff has already been learned. And as close as our task is to the original task, we can sort of use that first part of the network over again, and we only need to retrain the part that is actually going to be different. And so the more different our task is to the original task, the more of the network we're going to need to retrain, essentially. So, another way to think of this is that the network that already exists is used as a generic feature extractor. So it's just telling us if these patterns are present or absent at all. It's not telling us any sort of, reasoning about what that means for the task that we care about. But it's helping us to understand what kind of data is present in the input. Another way to think about it is that this is kind of like embeddings. So we're using the pre-trained network almost to produce an embedding for our image that has this meaningful representation that we can then go and do something else with. So we can almost replace our image with the embedding and then train a much simpler network to use that embedding in the way that we care about. And this, as it turns out, is a really effective way of, quickly getting strong performance on a new task. So, the summary of one way that we can do this is a process called fine tuning. And so for fine tuning, we're going to retrain some amount of the network, given some new data and new task. So just like with the transfer learning on the previous slide, we cut off the last few layers and replace them with new ones. But the other thing that we do is we freeze the weights of some parts of the network. And so freezing the weights means we're not going to update them anymore. But what we will do is update the weights of the last few layers in the network towards the very end where we have the complex features. This process is typically done with a smaller learning rate than for the first original training. And that's because we don't want to change these parameters as much as when the network was originally trained. But essentially, the relationship between these patterns might be slightly different in the case of whatever we're working on. And so we want the network to be able to adjust accordingly to that. Something else that we can take advantage of is data augmentation. So, in processing, in dealing with images, we can sort of artificially create more training data than we actually have by manipulating our input data in ways that change what the image looks like, but doesn't actually impact the subject of the image. So, in this example, these are all clearly still pictures of cats. The fact that we've slightly stretched them or flipped them or changed the color doesn't change what they're pictures of, but it allows us to get more slightly different examples of all of the things that the model should consider to be a cat in this example. And so, we can get essentially more bang for our buck in terms of, value out of each of our training samples by doing this data augmentation. It sort of teaches the model what it should care about and what it shouldn't care about in terms of the difference between these images. And Keras makes this really easy. There's an image data generator function where we can essentially just tell it, some of these things that we would like it to vary, and then it can automatically, vary it. This code is a little, these asterisks I think should be underscores. I don't know how that changed, but we can tell it all the things we would like it to vary, and it can just automatically make those changes at random. And crucial note, this is something that we do during training. It's not something we do during testing. So testing, we want to get an accurate sense of how the model performs on our real data. This is something we do during training, essentially to make the job harder, but harder in a way that will make the network perform better as it goes. Okay, so now let's switch to the labs. Just gonna stop my sharing for a second while I get that set up. And I'm going to start by going through the lab 3. Just give me a second. Lab 3. Sorry, I'm just setting up my environment. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Great.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the Movie Lens recommendation lab from yesterday. Now, this lab, I think, doesn't have a lot of things that we've asked you to do that, we didn't just talk through yesterday. So I'm probably going to go through this fairly quickly so we can get onto the new lab. But I did just want to take a second to talk through a couple of the things that are going on here. So the first, let me turn off my code completions, is this group by exercise here. So here we ask you to use the pandas library to quickly compute the average rating for each movie in the data set. So pandas does make this really, really easy. So we have this all ratings data set, and if we apply group by title, what that's going to do is it's going to turn into a collection every item that has a single entry here. So all of the entries that have Toy Story will become a single item. All of the entries that have Star Wars will be a single item, so on and so forth. And then what we can do is we can do something like say, take the mean. Oh, that's not going to work because I'm trying to take the mean of every column. We can select the rating column and then take the mean. And in a very small amount of code, we've now got the average rating for each movie. So we've grouped all of the data by the title. We've then selected the rating column and we've taken the mean for that column. And then that's done exactly that. And we can then go on further in different ways. This is really useful for aggregating the data in different ways. There's also an even more advanced .ag function. This allows you to essentially create new columns that combine the data in different ways. I am going to use my code completion here because I forget the specific syntax. There we go. Yeah. So to demonstrate, we're grouping by title. And using this .ag, I'm saying I want a new column called number of ratings. And that is selecting the ratings column and giving me the count. And I also want a new column called average ratings. And that is selecting the ratings and giving me the mean. And so when I run this, it will do exactly that. It selects for whatever is in the first value here, and it does the operation specified in the second value. And so this is a really quick little line of code that lets us do something that is fairly useful operationally. So now we can not only see the average rating, but we can see how many people gave it that rating. And this is useful, if only one person rated a movie, then it's not as meaningful to us if that rating is super high, things like that. Okay, moving on. We worked through this together yesterday. Let me run so that everything has been run. We trained our model. We asked you here, does it look like this model has overfit? Why or why not? So yesterday I said that I did think it had overfit, but only a very small amount, because we see that this line sort of either flattens or begins to go up just a tiny bit. Suggesting something we could do to prevent overfitting. So we could introduce a dropout layer up here. We could modify the learning rate possibly. The other thing that I would suggest looking at is the dimensionality of this embedding size, because it's possible that we might actually get better performance with a slightly smaller embedding, if that is something that is allowing overfitting to happen. So there's a few different options there, all of which could potentially help to prevent overfitting. We're going to plot our predictions, and then we look at the model embeddings again. And then I think the only thing that remains here is, oh yeah, I mean, I think I barely am going to go through this part because it really just is asking you to compare the similarity between some pairs of movies. So if you haven't done that, just pick some movies and compare how similar they are. I'll leave that one for you to do still, unless you have a question about it. Computing some movie similarities again. Here we do the t-SNE dimensionality reduction. And then at the end here, we ask you to try to modify the neural network to improve the quality of recommendation, either by adding more layers, a different loss function, or changing it in some other way. Now, if you've attempted this, you'll probably find that it's fairly hard to get a significantly better performance on this model. That is okay. If you submit this and you didn't get a better performance, that's fine. That's because we're sort of running up against how sophisticated this approach is for recommendation. We're only using a very limited amount of information about these users, so the quality of those predictions is not going to be that high. If you really wanted to see if you could dramatically improve the performance here, one thing that you could do is essentially try to simplify the problem. So right now we're trying to predict a star rating between 1 and 5. What you could do is you could say everything from 4 and 5 is good and everything from 1 to 3 is bad, and then just predict if a user is going to think a movie is good or bad based on that. And I would expect that you would probably get better performance on that task because it's a little bit easier. So that would be something that you can try if you're interested in seeing how that would impact the performance of the model. If not, if you just want to keep it simple, you can do something like change this embedding size. You can try it making it smaller. Let's see if that does anything. Very similar performance to before, but we do see that this time it didn't appear to overfit. So that's encouraging if nothing else. You can also add additional layers either before or after the flattening. So you could do a dense layer here, and then apply that before the output. You could also do that before, so you could add something like self.user transform, and that could be a dense layer that just is applied to the user embedding, and then a self.item transform that is just applied to the item embedding. There's different options that are available here. Truthfully, I think that adding more layers is probably just going to add to the overfitting problem on this task and not actually improve performance. But you're welcome to try it and see if I'm wrong on that. And then lastly, you could do something like replacing the optimizer or reducing the learning rate, seeing if that has any impact as well. Okay, are there any lingering questions on lab 3 before I move on to lab 4? Yeah, Vinod says that he tried adding more layers and it made the result worse. Yeah, I think there's a significant risk of overfitting here. Okay, I'm going to move on to lab 4. So this lab is quite interactive in that we ask you to sort of look at how convolutions are going to apply and modify images that we're looking at. And so I want to leave a lot of that for you to do. We'll give you some time tonight to work on that, maybe in breakout rooms. So I'm not going to talk through exactly how to do those parts, but I will give you an introduction to this lab. The first thing to know is that this lab uses the scikit image library. So if you don't have that installed, it's going to be pip install scikit image. I have it installed, but you'll need to do that if you don't have it already, or conda install as the case may be. And so we can load this picture of a coffee, and we can apply some convolutions to it. So the first thing that we're going to do here, without even training a neural network, is just looking at how a convolution as an operation sort of impacts and applies to the image that we're working with. So here what we've done is we've loaded the convolutional layer from Keras, and we've initialized this convolutional layer, but just as a single layer. It's not part of a larger neural network. And so as with any of our neural network layers, this is going to start with a random initialization, right? So it's going to have a random set of weights. And what happens if we try to apply this to the image is that we're going to see some kind of random output, right? So it has been applied to the image here. This is being shown as RGB, but this is being applied separately to each of those 3 color channels when we're running it. Like we mentioned, it doesn't consider across the 3 color channels, it does them all separately. And if we start from here again, if we initialize our convolutional layer again, then when we run this, we're going to get a different output each time because this is randomly initialized. So this doesn't contain any specific meaning, but we can see that the convolutional layer has applied some kind of operation to the input images in that process. So moving on from that, we'll try looking at a convolutional kernel that does have a clear purpose. This is one of the most basic kernels that you can build, which is an averaging kernel. And so what this is going to do is in a 5x5 grid, it'll just take the average value of all the pixels in that 5x5 grid. And what you're going to see is that this essentially looks like a blurring operation on the image. So hopefully you can see that, this now looks slightly blurrier on the right than it does on the left. And so I hope that sort of makes sense that what we're describing here is a 5 by 5 where we're multiplying each pixel by 1 over 25, and then we're adding up all those values. So we're replacing the value with each pixel with an average in the region around it, and that causes it to blur. This is a very basic blur. You can also do what's called a Gaussian blur, where the dividing value is larger towards the center of that kernel than it is towards the edges, which sort of, if you imagine it, looks like a bell curve, right? So we're taking more of the value in the middle than we are on the edges, and that's how you produce a Gaussian blur. Here we ask you to try changing some of the settings in the convolutional layer to see how they affect the result. I'm going to walk through this. So we ask you to try different kernel sizes as well as to look at the padding function. So try pad valid instead of same. So it's sort of so in order to change the size of the kernel, we can go here and we can say, instead of 5, 5, we want, let's say 10, 10. Let's see if that works. Aha, that was, yes, I know exactly why that happened. So okay, before I answer it, can anyone guess why this didn't do a blur and instead did something weird when I went from 5, 5 to 10, 10 in this kernel? I'll give you a hint. It's got to do with this value. What is 5 times 5? Right. I think Saad got it. So in a 5 by 5 kernel, where we're trying to take the average, the amount that we want each pixel to be multiplied by is 1 over 25, so that when we add it all up, we get back to 100%. So there's 25 values, we're adding them together, we're dividing the total by 25. So if I increase this to 10 by 10, then I need to correspondingly increase this value to 100. And then that means that it will still operate as a blur in the way that we expected. And so just like we hoped, when we do that 10 by 10 kernel, this image looks even blurrier than it did before. And I'll do one more example just to sort of drive it home. If we do 20 by 20, then we need a value of 400 here. And then this should look extremely blurry when we run it. Yeah, so, and you can also now see how the edges are kind of black because we're taking the average, and it includes this big area of pixels that don't exist at the edges. And if we replace the padding of same with valid, that goes away. So valid means that we're not doing any padding at the edges. We're only computing the possible strides where the whole kernel is on top of the image. But when we do same, it will go off of the edges and it will compute the kernel where, part of the kernel is in the image and part of it is off the side. And when we do that, you can see that the edges then accordingly are like starting to get a bit darker because of that. The other thing that it asks here is this may change the size of the output. You won't really notice it here, but the image on the right is slightly smaller than the image on the left if we use the valid operation. It's sort of, you can't even see it on that output, but I think if I print the shapes of these, then you should be able to see image. Sorry, so print image in dot shape, print image out. Oh, it's np image out. This is actually, yeah. So you can see that because we're not doing the striding, because we're not considering the situations where the image is going off of the edge, we have slightly fewer output values than we have input values here. And so that's what that is asking you about. So you don't really need to put any code in this cell, but please do try making this kernel size different at the very least. Okay, so that is an example of a blurring kernel, very, very basic kernel that we can do. And the next one we'll look at is an edge detection kernel. So, to simplify the task here, we're going to work with a grayscale image that, there's just one color channel. But what we're going to build is the edge detector kernel, which actually predates the application of this technology to deep learning. If you go to this Wikipedia link, it has a whole list of different kernels that you can conceivably apply. Let me share that screen. So here is a list of kernels that we can try out and previews of what they're going to do for the sample image. So this is the original image here. And we can see that here is Gaussian blur that I was talking about, where the value is higher in the middle and lower around the edges. Box blur is what I just showed you in the lab, where we're just taking the simple average of all the values. A larger Gaussian blur. What you're asked to do here is try one of these edge detection kernels. And so what you can see is that what happens with the edge detection kernels is it essentially highlights areas where there's a lot of contrast in the image. So where we go from one block of the image to another block. So here where there's this clear line at the edge of, I don't even know what this animal is actually, but we can see the edge here, and that is highlighted in the edge detection kernel, as are other bits of hard contrast. So yeah, go through here, take a look at these, but the one that we want you to pull out is sort of one of these edge detection kernels. So switching, maybe it is a capybara. I won't get too much in a digression about that. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Okay, so here we're going to implement one of those kernels, right? And use it for edge detection. So it's 3 by 3. We're just literally going to write this kernel in. So 3 by 3. There's different ways you can do it. I'll invite you to try one of the ones that is in the Wikipedia page yourself. The one that I'm going to do is just a vertical edge detector. So 0, -1, 0, 0, 3, or is it 2, 0? Yeah, 0, -1, 0. And so what this is going to do is just in a straight line, or I think this is actually going to have a horizontal impact. It's vertical in the computation and horizontal in the impact. It's going to subtract the pixel values directly above and below from the center value. So if they are the same as each other, then the total value will go to 0. But if they are very different from each other, then this value will actually be positive. And so that's what this will do to the image, and we'll see the impact. But yeah, for you, you can do anything you want here. The key consideration is that it should the sum of these values should balance out. So here, -1 plus -1 plus 2 is equal to 0. Just make sure you have something like that. Oh, I think this has to be np.array. I think that's what I did wrong there. Aha, great. Okay, yeah, so it's done something for sure. We can see that, what it's really, really picked up here more than anything else actually is like the wood grain in the table. But we can see that, some of the highlights here of the lighting on the cup have been picked up. And like the edge around here has also been picked up. So there is a bit of edge detection going on. And yeah, so I want you to have a look at this. I don't want to do it all for you. So, please try different values and sort of see how that impacts the effect of this. But, this is how you do it. So, np.array, and then you can just manually write out this array. and the rest of the code will take that and use it as the kernel for you. So try different things and sort of see how that impacts it. The next section is going to show how we can try pooling. So we're going to, again, we're not even building a network, but we're just going to apply a pooling or a max pooling array directly. So here we see some examples of what first max pooling and then average pooling looks like for our image. So the original image, and then with max pooling, we can see that it's a quarter of the size now. So, this is like 640. Now this is like 140. And we can see that the max pooling has made it very blocky because at each pixel, it's the largest value that is being retained. So it's different from a blur. For the average pooling, the dimensionality is reduced, but it looks more like a blur than this does. And you can particularly notice this in the spoon if you look in this image. So for the max pooling, it really picks up on the reflections in the spoon because those are high white values. Whereas in the average pooling, it just looks like it's blurred down to the lower resolution. Using the scikit image library, we can apply this to different images. We can do different transforms. So here we're transforming this higher resolution image of a cat to 50 by 50 pixels, and we're squishing it in order to do that. The reason that we're showing you this is because in the next section, we load a pre-trained model. So Keras lets us load pre-trained models, including ResNet, which we talked about in the lecture. And here we're specifying that we want a ResNet model that has been pre-trained on that ImageNet task. And so when we run this, it will actually download the model. And as you can see, it's huge. It's got lots and lots of parameters to it. But that's okay because we're not going to train it at all. We're just going to use it and see what it does. So I'm going to leave this task for you, but all we're asking you to do is to reshape that cat image to 224 by 224 by 3. And you can copy the code from above here. Let me, sorry, that's huge. Okay, never mind. You can copy this code up here in order to figure out how to resize the image. But we want it to be 224 by 224 by 3. And then we want you to run the preprocess input on that image, and then finally use the predict and the decode predictions method here. Again, I'll talk about this all tomorrow night. I just want you to attempt it first to see how ResNet actually predicts for that image, to see if it is able to, correctly predict it as a cat or not. And then the very last thing, and this is fully optional, is that this code can let you take a screenshot from your webcam if you have one, and then you can apply the pre-processing and see if the ResNet 50 model is able to predict whatever the content of that image is. If you don't feel comfortable doing this, you can just upload an image into the file system and load that instead. And you can just do that by using the same code that we see up here that lets us load this cat image. So if you don't want to do the webcam thing, don't worry about it. Yeah. Okay, so we have about half an hour left. I'm going to put you into breakout groups. And so what I would like for you to do is first to try changing the parameters here, change the size of this kernel. The second thing I would like you to do is try implementing your own kernel in this myKernel function to see how it affects the operation. And then the last thing I want you to do is to complete this pre-trained model section to try to predict the content of this picture of a cat, as well as another picture, a picture from your webcam or something else. Okay, can I ask the learning support to please assign everyone to a breakout room, and we will get started on that. maybe I can do it. I think I can do it. Uh, okay, go ahead and get started. And so to the learning support, I'm going to give everyone until 8 to sort of get settled in their rooms, and then we can start going through the rooms and asking if anyone has any questions.